There is a kind of pain that doesn't begin when someone betrays you. It begins much earlier, while everything still seems normal. In fact, that's what makes it so difficult to recognize. Nothing appears broken. There are no dramatic endings, no obvious signs that something important is changing. Life continues exactly as it did before. You talk to the same people, follow the same routines, and carry the same responsibilities. Yet somewhere beneath all of that, a quiet discomfort starts growing, and you can't quite explain where it's coming from. At first, it feels like ordinary emotional exhaustion. You're more drained than usual. Small interactions seem heavier than they should. Conversations that once felt effortless now require energy. You tell yourself you're just tired, stressed, distracted, or overwhelmed. After all, adulthood teaches people to normalize exhaustion. Most of us become so accustomed to carrying emotional weight that we stop asking where it came from. But then there are those moments when everything becomes strangely quiet. Maybe it's late at night after everyone has gone to sleep. Maybe it's during a drive with no music playing. Maybe it's in the middle of an ordinary afternoon when your mind suddenly drifts somewhere you weren't expecting. And without warning, a thought appears that you've been avoiding for longer than you realized. Something doesn't feel right. Not dramatically wrong. Not enough to confront. Not enough to explain. Just different. The uncomfortable part is that the feeling rarely points to a specific event. Instead, it points to a person, someone you trust, someone whose presence has become so familiar that you've stopped questioning the role they play in your emotional life. You don't immediately suspect them because trust doesn't work that way. Trust isn't simply believing someone won't hurt you. It's slowly becoming less aware of the possibility that they can. That's why some of the deepest emotional wounds arrive unnoticed. The closer someone becomes, the less attention we pay to the ways they affect us. We notice strangers. We notice critics. We notice people we don't like. But the people we trust often move beneath our awareness. We allow their words to matter more. We allow their opinions to carry greater weight. We allow them access to parts of ourselves that nobody else sees. And because that process happens gradually, we rarely realize how much emotional influence we've given away until something begins to hurt. The strange thing is that many people can sense this long before they consciously understand it. They start overthinking conversations they never used to analyze. They replay interactions while trying to figure out why something feels off. They notice themselves becoming unusually sensitive to certain comments or disappointments. What once felt secure now feels uncertain, but not uncertain enough to explain. So they ignore it. They stay busy. They distract themselves. They convince themselves they're imagining things. Because acknowledging the feeling would force them to ask a question they may not be ready to answer. What if the person I trust isn't the person I believe they are? Most people don't ask that question immediately. In fact, many spend months avoiding it. Some spend years, not because the evidence isn't there, but because trust creates emotional inertia. Once we've built a certain story about someone, our minds naturally resist information that threatens that story. We would rather explain away discomfort than reconsider someone who has become important to us. And that is where this silent pain begins to take shape. Not in betrayal itself, but in the growing distance between what we feel and what we're willing to admit. One part of us starts noticing cracks in the connection, while another part works tirelessly to preserve the image we've already created. The result is a quiet, internal conflict that nobody else can see. From the outside, everything appears normal. Inside, something is slowly unraveling. And before we can understand why trusting the wrong person hurts so deeply, we first need to understand why trust itself has such extraordinary power over the human mind. In the next part, we'll explore the hidden psychological bargain we make every time we let someone become emotionally important to us. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. What makes this experience so difficult to understand is that the pain rarely stays focused on the other person. At some point, it begins spreading into places that seem completely unrelated. You may notice yourself becoming less present in conversations, less excited about things you normally enjoy, less certain about opinions that once felt obvious. The problem no longer feels confined to a relationship. Somehow, it starts affecting the relationship you have with yourself. One of the strangest parts is how gradually this happens. There isn't a clear moment when you become emotionally disconnected. Instead, life begins feeling slightly muted. Not empty, not unbearable, just distant. You still participate in your routines. You still answer questions when people ask how you're doing. You still complete tasks and move through responsibilities. Yet, somewhere beneath the surface, there's a growing sense that you're no longer fully experiencing your own life. You're observing it more than living it. And because nothing appears dramatically wrong, most people never stop to examine it. They assume they're tired, busy, distracted. But occasionally a small moment breaks through the routine. You're sitting with friends and everyone is laughing, yet somehow you feel detached from the experience. Not excluded, just unable to reach it emotionally. You recognize that you're supposed to be enjoying yourself, but the feeling never fully arrives. It remains just out of reach, like watching your own life through a window. This creates a kind of confusion that is difficult to explain to anyone else. After all, how do you describe the feeling of becoming unfamiliar to yourself? How do you explain that nothing has changed and yet everything feels different? Most people don't have language for experiences like this. They only feel the consequences. They become quieter, more withdrawn, more likely to keep thoughts to themselves because explaining them feels impossible. Over time, another subtle pattern begins to emerge. You become increasingly focused on maintaining emotional stability around other people, not because anyone asks you to, but because unpredictability starts feeling exhausting. You choose your words carefully. You monitor reactions. You adjust your behavior without even realizing you're doing it. What began as consideration slowly becomes adaptation. Then adaptation becomes habit. The strange thing about habits is that they eventually stop feeling like choices. You become the easygoing one, the understanding one, the person who doesn't make things complicated, the person who accepts explanations, overlooks disappointments, and remains patient when patience is no longer coming naturally. From the outside, these behaviors can appear mature, responsible even. Yet internally, something else may be happening. Every adjustment requires a small sacrifice, a feeling ignored, a concern postponed, a disappointment quietly swallowed before it can become visible. Most of these sacrifices seem insignificant in the moment. That's why they're so dangerous. Rarely does someone wake up and consciously decide to abandon themselves. Instead, it happens through hundreds of tiny decisions that barely register. The conversation you don't have, the boundary you don't express, the feeling you dismiss because it seems inconvenient, the discomfort you explain away because confronting it would create tension. Months later, the emotional cost begins appearing in unexpected places. You find yourself unusually exhausted after ordinary social interactions. You need more time alone, yet being alone doesn't necessarily feel restful. Your mind keeps returning to the same unresolved feelings, not because you're trying to think about them, but because they were never fully acknowledged in the first place. It's as if part of you has been patiently waiting for attention while another part remains determined to stay busy. This creates a peculiar split inside many people. One version continues functioning normally. It attends meetings, responds to messages, makes plans, fulfills obligations. The other version carries a growing sense of emotional weight that never quite gets expressed. Most of the time, these two versions coexist quietly. Then something unexpected happens. A comment, a memory, a seemingly insignificant disappointment, and suddenly the emotional reaction feels larger than the situation itself. Not because of that single moment, because it was never about that single moment. Sometimes the reaction belongs to months of accumulated feelings that never found a place to go. And perhaps that's why certain memories become so persistent. Not necessarily the dramatic ones. Often it's something much smaller. A conversation that felt slightly off. A moment when you didn't feel heard. An interaction that left you questioning yourself afterward. These memories return not because they're important on their own, but because they seem connected to something your mind still hasn't fully understood. You may even find yourself revisiting old versions of yourself, thinking about who you were before this relationship, before this friendship, before this emotional confusion entered your life. Not because you want to return to the past, but because you're trying to locate the point where something started changing. The unsettling realization is that the answer rarely appears where you expect it, because the deepest shifts often happen quietly, beneath awareness, long before they become visible. And that raises a question many people spend years avoiding. If trusting the wrong person can slowly pull someone away from their own feelings, their instincts, and even their sense of self, then what is actually happening beneath the surface? Why does emotional pain sometimes spread far beyond the person who caused it? In the next section, we'll begin approaching that question. Because underneath these patterns, these adaptations, and these silent forms of self-abandonment, there may be a deeper psychological mechanism quietly shaping the entire experience. And once it becomes visible, many things that felt confusing suddenly begin to make sense. As the confusion continues, another possibility slowly begins to emerge, and it's often one people resist far more than the idea that someone hurt them. It is relatively easy to examine another person's behavior. It is much harder to examine the role we unknowingly played in our own suffering. Not because we caused it, and not because we deserved it, but because certain emotional habits can become so familiar that we stop recognizing them as habits at all. Many people eventually arrive at a moment where they stop asking what happened and start asking why they stayed emotionally invested long after something inside them began feeling unsettled. The question is uncomfortable because it challenges the version of the story they've been telling themselves. For a long time, it seemed like the problem existed entirely outside of them. The other person's inconsistency, distance, indifference, or inability to reciprocate appeared to explain everything. Yet after enough reflection, a more complicated picture begins to appear. They remember the conversations that left them feeling unseen but said nothing because they didn't want to create tension. They remember moments of disappointment that were immediately followed by explanations and justifications. They remember instincts that quietly suggested something was wrong, only to be dismissed because acknowledging them would have forced a difficult conversation or an even more difficult decision. Looking back, the painful realization is not that these moments happened. The painful realization is how normal they felt. That normality is what makes these patterns so difficult to detect. Most people do not consciously decide to ignore their feelings. Instead, they become skilled at deprioritizing them. They learn to remain understanding when they feel hurt, flexible when they feel uncomfortable, and patient when they feel uncertain. Over time, these responses begin to feel like evidence of emotional maturity. Yet there are moments when what appears to be maturity is actually fear wearing a more acceptable face. Fear does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it appears as endless understanding. Sometimes it appears as giving people one more chance, then another, then another after that. Sometimes it appears as constantly searching for explanations, because explanations are easier to live with than disappointment. As long as there is another explanation, there is still a reason to stay hopeful. As long as there is hope, there is no need to confront what the situation might actually be revealing. This creates a subtle conflict that many people carry for years without fully recognizing. Part of them wants honesty. Another part wants comfort. Part of them wants clarity. Another part wants the relationship, friendship, or connection to survive. And when those desires begin pulling in opposite directions, clarity often becomes the sacrifice. Not because they are incapable of seeing reality, but because reality threatens something emotionally important. The deeper realization is that trust sometimes becomes intertwined with identity in ways we rarely acknowledge. Certain people do not simply occupy a place in our lives. They occupy a place in our understanding of ourselves. We become the supportive friend, the dependable partner, the patient listener, the person who can always be counted on. These identities can feel meaningful, even noble. But when maintaining them requires repeatedly dismissing our own feelings, they begin costing more than we realize. What makes this particularly painful is that emotional adaptation often disguises itself as personality. Someone may spend years believing they are naturally easygoing without noticing how often they silence discomfort. They may see themselves as exceptionally understanding without noticing how rarely they expect understanding in return. They may pride themselves on being low maintenance while quietly carrying needs they have convinced themselves are unreasonable. Eventually, however, reality creates friction. The emotional exhaustion grows harder to ignore. The loneliness becomes more difficult to explain away. The distance between what a person feels and what they express becomes increasingly uncomfortable. And somewhere within that discomfort, a question begins to emerge. Not a question about the other person, but about themselves. What if the deepest wound was never just the betrayal of trust? What if part of the pain comes from recognizing how often they abandoned their own emotional reality in order to preserve a connection they were afraid to lose? That question does not arrive with an immediate answer. It lingers. It follows people into quiet evenings, long walks, and sleepless nights. Yet once it appears, something starts changing. The focus gradually shifts away from the person who caused the hurt and toward the hidden emotional patterns that allowed the hurt to remain unquestioned for so long. And that shift, although subtle, opens the door to a completely different way of understanding what has been happening beneath the surface all along. After a certain point, the question slowly changes. For a long time, the attention was fixed on the person who caused the pain, their actions, their choices, their inconsistencies. The mind kept returning to them, trying to find the missing explanation that would finally make everything fit together. Yet the longer someone sits with the experience, the more they begin noticing that the explanation they were searching for may never arrive in the form they expected. Some people spend years waiting for a perfect answer, a conversation that clarifies everything, an apology that suddenly makes the confusion disappear. A moment of understanding that neatly organizes all the loose pieces. But life rarely provides emotional experiences in such a satisfying way. More often, the unanswered questions remain unanswered, and the person is left with something far more challenging than certainty. They are left with themselves. At first, this realization can feel disappointing. There is a part of us that wants the story to remain simple. Someone hurt us. Someone betrayed our trust. Someone failed to value what we offered. Those things may all be true. Yet when the emotional dust begins to settle, another reality starts becoming visible. The experience was never only about another person's actions. It was also revealing something about the emotional patterns we carried into the relationship long before the pain appeared. What makes this perspective different is that it no longer asks who was right or wrong. Instead, it begins asking different questions. Questions that are quieter, less dramatic, but often more revealing. Why did certain behaviors feel familiar even when they hurt? Why did some disappointments take so long to acknowledge? Why was it easier to doubt personal feelings than to question a connection that no longer felt safe? These questions do not emerge from self-blame. In fact, self-blame often prevents people from seeing clearly. When people blame themselves, they remain trapped in the same cycle of judgment that kept them disconnected in the first place. Understanding requires something different. It requires the willingness to observe without immediately condemning. And perhaps that is where a subtle shift begins. The person who constantly over-explained someone else's behavior may start realizing they were trying to protect more than the relationship. They were protecting the version of reality they wanted to believe in. The person who kept giving endless chances may begin recognizing that hope was serving a purpose beyond optimism. It was helping them avoid a loss they were not ready to face. The person who repeatedly silenced their discomfort may finally notice that the silence itself was not weakness. It was a strategy that once felt necessary. Seen from this angle, many emotional habits start looking different. What once appeared irrational begins revealing its logic. What once seemed like a flaw begins revealing its history. What once felt embarrassing begins revealing the quiet fears that shaped it. This doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't suddenly transform difficult experiences into positive ones, but it changes the way those experiences are understood. Instead of viewing every emotional adaptation as evidence that something is wrong with them, people sometimes begin recognizing that these adaptations developed for a reason. They were attempts to preserve connection, avoid rejection, maintain stability, or protect against uncertainty. The problem is not that these strategies existed. The problem is that they continued operating long after their cost became greater than their usefulness. That realization can feel strangely bittersweet, because when people look back, they often discover that many of the behaviors they criticized most harshly were never signs of weakness. They were signs of someone trying to navigate emotional complexity with the tools they had at the time. The overthinking, the people-pleasing, the endless attempts to understand everyone else, the tendency to dismiss personal feelings, none of these patterns appeared randomly. They emerged slowly, often unnoticed, becoming part of daily life until they seemed indistinguishable from personality itself. And perhaps that is why awareness feels different from judgment. Judgment asks, why am I like this? Awareness asks, what was I trying to protect? One question closes the conversation, the other opens it. As this perspective develops, something else begins changing. The emotional story becomes less focused on the person who broke the trust, and more focused on the relationship someone has with their own inner experience. The disappointments remain real. The hurt remains real. But the attention gradually shifts towards something that existed beneath all of it. The tendency to overlook personal feelings while prioritizing the preservation of connection. For many people, this realization arrives quietly, not during a dramatic breakthrough, not during a life-changing moment. It appears in ordinary situations, a conversation that suddenly feels different, a memory revisited from a new angle, a late-night thought that lingers longer than usual. And without fully realizing why, they begin seeing their emotional history differently than they did before. Not with complete clarity, not with complete certainty, just enough to recognize that the story may have always been larger than the person who caused the pain. Maybe the most silent pain comes from trusting the wrong person. But maybe the deeper discovery is noticing all the ways we learned to stop trusting ourselves along the way. And perhaps that realization doesn't arrive to provide closure. Perhaps it arrives simply to be noticed. Because some truths do not change your life the moment you understand them. They sit quietly in the background, slowly changing the way you see yourself, your relationships, and the emotional habits you've carried for years. Does any part of this feel familiar to you? Have you ever looked back and realized the deepest lesson wasn't about the other person at all? Tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts.